Hello, everyone, and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church, Spirit of Truth Outreach for the final talk on the moral argument on Baggett's book, The Morals of the Story. The Moral of the Story. So today we're wrapping up. We're going to kind of look back on some of the things we've talked about. We're going to just briefly go over some of the things we learned about the four major prongs of the moral argument as presented. And we're going to talk about some of the implications. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why this is actually an effective argument. And not only that, but really address some of the more metaphysical concerns of this. You know, what should we do in terms of our belief system? How should this impact us? What decisions should we make? How should this impact our view of the world, creation, and our position in it? So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And so I want to go ahead and just again define what this moral argument is. So it's a cumulative argument, which means again that we're bringing together a number of different lines of evidence, and not just one realm of evidence, but we're bringing a number of different lines of evidence and saying that these evidence suggest that, you know, theism is correct, or at least the best possible position. It's an abductive argument in that, again, it's going to argue that Christianity is the best explanation for the data, but it doesn't by necessity rule out other explanations. Okay, it's also a teleological argument in that morality is end-directed with the divine purpose and goal, God's kingdom and his righteousness, and the abundant life for which we were created. Now, I want to go ahead and just talk about each of these four prongs one last time, with regard to both moral values and obligations. Okay, so again, the first two prongs of the arguments. Moral values, it's specifically the intrinsic value of human beings in and of themselves. Again, humanity functions as a natural sign of God's reality, but doesn't mandate his existence. And there are two sort of signs that we see that indicate there might be a God. First is our sense of moral obligation. We have an obligation to something. We recognize it when we do something wrong, beyond just ourselves, beyond just people around us. We have a moral obligation. And second, we have a special sense of worth and dignity. And this is, again, why you can't put a price on a person. You can't put a price on a person because we intrinsically value ourselves as worthy and as having basic dignity. And other theories fail to ground and defend this intrinsic human dignity and basic human rights. Again, naturalists have an appreciation of human dignity. I would never argue that they don't. But they can't make a case or defend it really well. Again, you've got flip of foot, for example, in the natural normativities, where things that are naturally conducive to our survival and flourishing have moral significance. Okay, but again, the problem is that's an explanation for it, maybe why it exists, or how it exists, I should say, how it comes about. But that doesn't talk about, for example, why human survival is in itself good. In fact, there are some who would argue that human survival is not good because we put a great toll on the planet, for example. Okay, so there are people who even argue against that. So again, why is human survival itself good? Then you have Christina Korsgaard using a Kantian approach. What separates humans from animals is the ability to act on the basis of self-conception or a practical identity. And then this then creates unconditional obligations. Okay, so again, this idea to act on the basis of self-conception, practical identity. But again, what about the mobster? Okay, self-identity, self-conception. I can act in line with that, and thus it's moral. You go to the prostitute. I self-identify in that way. I have self-conception, so my practical identity, and thus that becomes moral. Okay, so the problem is we have deeper obligations than simply our roles that give us morality. Okay. We have a deeper identity as moral beings. We value ourselves as human beings, but again, this essentially devolves into a moral realism. We have intrinsic value based on what we are. So again, you start to see with each of these, it's like they're good at explaining why morals might exist in a sense, but they don't explain the greater concern of what's the purpose of it. Okay. Then there's the social contrarian, which is we simply agree to accord and respect the rights of others. But again, the problem of that is contingent. So rights are sort of contingent in this case. And they tend to deny that there are intrinsic human rights. And contingent rights are scary because contingent rights can be taken away. If you have contingent rights, that means they don't always have to be rights. And that's actually the frightening thing with how the government and how people are trying to place rights nowadays. They're treating these as contingent. Okay? So the problem is when you argue for rights of a specific subset of a community based on their humanity, you have this problem of saying, well, we'll just say, for example, Asian American rights. I'm just making something up. Asian American rights. Well, what does that even mean? Rights based on the fact that you're an Asian American, okay, but what are those rights? Well, you have to kind of make them up. There isn't anything about being an Asian or American that gives you more basic human rights. And this is sort of the problem with this, contingent rights. They can be given and taken away. And unfortunately, with contingent rights, rights that divide communities, they always end up oppressing someone else. In granting someone a right, you inherently oppress someone else. It's a key piece of this. Now, what about the Christian understanding? Well, we say the value of human persons is found in the personhood of God. Value is based on the fact of a being made in God's image. That persons aren't just valuable in aggregate, but also valuable as individuals, and they hold inestimable worth and dignity. That we were created for a purpose, imbued with inalienable rights, invited into a relationship of love, created for good works and specific calling. So again, when you look at the other views, and I want to make sure I make a point of this, it doesn't mean that Christianity is correct. I'm just simply saying that when we look at the other views, it's fascinating to me how robust the Christian worldview is, not just in its explanation for the existence of rights, but also for what these rights entail. Again, as I say, we're created for a purpose. We're imbued with inalienable rights. We're invited into a relationship of love. We're created for good works, specific calling. The problem is when you go to non-Christian views, you lose all of that. And you lose it very fast. And this is the thing. It's what could you live for as a naturalist? The self, the society, something that's transient, something that changes constantly. There is no greater purpose. There is no, again, and one could say, well, I'm making my own greater purpose, or I'm making my own greater morality. I'm going to live up to that. But again, it's just a figment of one's mind, and that's the problem. If it's not real, it's not actually of worth. Things have to be real to be of worth. In terms of when we're talking about things like morality, when we're talking about things of purpose and stuff like that. If the purpose you're shooting for is non-real, it'll never happen. Then what's the point of it? If your morality is just a construct of your mind that can change flippantly, then what's the point of it? And some might say, well, it creates some good. Yeah, but your concept of good changes. See, this is the problem. If it's not rooted in something, if it's not objectively rooted in something, we throw these words around like good and right and wrong and evil, and we say, no, I can justify that my relative morality says there's good and evil. Okay, yeah, but you haven't rooted good and evil. So you run into these issues when you start to talk about human persons. Well, why is a human person valuable? Well, all of a sudden, if you can redefine human person as you want, you can rule out people who are old, you can rule out people who are very young, you can rule out people who have mental handicaps. I mean, again, this is the problem. When you walk away from an image of God standard, when you walk away from an absolute moral standard, you lose a lot more than you think you gain. And that's what I hope this can show you, is that no, you've indeed lost a lot more than you've gained in that. You might have gained the ability to do things you otherwise would not have wanted, or you otherwise would not be able to do. And I don't deny that. See, the thing is, and I've had conversations recently where people have talked about how they feel more free not being in a Christian, not being a Christian church. And I pondered that for a while, and I think I figured out why that statement was the case. And actually, it has to do with another book that I've been reading recently, which talked about how, actually, sermons I've been reading lately, which talked about how if you attempt to give people God's morality, and again, and when I use the term swine, I'm using the scriptural word for it here. Don't throw your pearls before swine, or they'll trample on them, turn on you, and tear you to pieces. And it's interesting because to attempt to give people who do not believe in God the Christian morality, and to say you have to obey this, they'll rebel against it. They'll see it as constricting. They'll see it as a destruction of their freedom, because they view freedom as the ability to enact whatever their will so desires. And they think that their will is relatively neutral. Okay? The problem is that unless the gospel and Jesus Christ's death on the cross and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and spiritual regeneration occur in a person, unless that occurs, you're not going to have the reception of a godly instruction, godly knowledge, and godly will, which to the Christian person, to the regenerate heart, is more freeing. Why? Because the non-Christian wants the type of freedom, and I'm going to take a little drink here, my throat's all dry, wants the type of freedom that allows him to enact whatever good or evil thing he or she wishes to do. The Christian understanding of freedom is actually a freedom from evil. It's a freedom from the enslavement of sin. It's a freedom from doing wrong. Because you see, the Christian person, the born-again person, recognized that there has been a pull, a pull to do evil, and that this pull to do evil is very strong, and it's borderline impossible to break out of. It's only by the help of God that one can. And so again, in these things, when we look at objective morality, people often mar Christianity for its objective morality. Oh, your morals are outdated. No, they're not outdated. You've just redefined freedom. You've redefined freedom to be able to do good or evil, or to be able to simply say that there is no such thing as good and evil. I can do whatever I want. Whereas Christianity simply argues that its morality is freedom from evil. And there it is. Christian morality is simple. It's freedom from evil. It's freedom from the bonds of sin. It's freedom from any of evil's effects. It's a perfect utopian society in some sense. Now the problem is you can't just simply say, oh, I want to follow the Christian morality, and then everything goes out perfect. Unfortunately, sin has greater effects than just the momentary. Sin permanently ruined humanity. And that's why we need God's help to overcome this. So I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that, because that's kind of an interesting concept here. The second was this moral obligations. So again, they're authoritative, and they're an odd fit in a naturalistic world. There wouldn't really be moral obligations in a naturalistic world. Why would anyone have authority and power over someone else in terms of morality? At best, each individual organism is its own kind of God, and I wouldn't see why there'd be anything any different than that. And so yet we have this structure. We have it where when you break all moral obligations, society and humanity just die off. It's anarchy. It can't last. It doesn't last. And so moral obligations do need an account. We do have to account for these things. We have to say, well, why are they here? What are they? Christian theism, again, has an interesting answer. It says that entailing a loving, perfect God who commands, who knows us better than we know ourselves, who knows truly what is in our ultimate best interest, and who desires the best for us. And that this God can most, and that this worldview can most effectively provide moral obligations and make us accountable. See, here's the thing. To the non-Christian, moral obligations, looking at Christian moral obligations and the Christian God, again, seem like destroying their freedom, seem like all of these other things. But here's the sad thing. God knows us better than ourselves. He knows what's in our best interests. And the only real answer that naturalists have against Christian morality is simply, I just don't want to do that. I dare anyone to try and prove that murder is actually a positive and good thing, that stealing is a positive and good thing, that aberrant sexuality is a positive and good thing. I dare anybody to try to prove it. Typically, when people try, they only prove their further moral depravity. But it's a fascinating thing. The only real answer people have is, well, because I choose what is good and right for me. But it's not actually based on anything other than personal experience. And so moral obligations are here. We do have a moral obligation to do the right thing, and according to God. And insofar as society chooses to do that, they prosper. Insofar as they choose to reject that, they decline. When you look at a country like America, and I'm going to go ahead and pontificate a little bit here, since this is our final one on morality for a while. I think no one would be hard-pressed to say that we're in a situation where the country's thriving, where innovation and invention is thriving. Now, some can say, well, look at the medical advances, look at all these things. Yeah, when you get actually into that stuff, though, the first thing you realize is that a lot of that came from advances that came earlier in the century, and that those are where the real advances were. Same with a lot of invention. And that what's happening now is just sort of turning the crank on things that have been done before. But the second thing is this, is as a culture, what are we seeing? Increases in crime. What are we seeing? Increases in evil activity, things that most people would say are evil or not good. That we aren't in a better place. And why is that? Why is it that when something gets bigger, it automatically goes into depravity? Well, I don't think that just because something's bigger, it has to go into depravity. I think what fundamentally happens is that as things get bigger, as you have new people moving into your community, if your community held to a Christian moral standard, you're still going to have bad things done. But in general, you have a society environment that promotes the doing of good things. And once you begin to reject that, and you walk away from that, and you tell people there are no moral obligations, I mean, let's just take a look at this. Naturalistic account. Is there intrinsic value in humanity? Nothing beyond what humans say of themselves, which is extremely narcissistic, so no. Moral obligations? There are none. So now you tell a kid that there's no real purpose. They're going to die, so you kind of give them a fear that they can never existentially get out of. There's no moral obligations, so you can live however you want to live. And some people would say, well, now that kid's perfectly primed to be a model citizen. I would say 100% not. That kid's perfectly primed to be a criminal. Because it's the criminal that doesn't value other human beings. It's the criminal that doesn't value themselves. It's the criminal that doesn't see beyond the moment. It's the criminal that doesn't have an obligation to do the right thing because of maybe their circumstances or whatever else. So no, you've raised a criminal is what you've raised. You haven't raised a model citizen. A model citizen has dignity, has purpose, has design, understands how he or she fits into the plan of God in the wider world, and has intrinsic human value. Now, what about this concept of evil and agency, though? Now, I would argue that there are some that do not recognize evil, but I would argue that there is a near universal recognition of evil if you were to poll all of humanity across the world. There's going to be pockets of people who deny the existence of evil. I don't doubt that, philosophers and things, and just some people. But in general, people recognize that, yeah, the Holocaust was evil. It wasn't just something I disagree with, it was evil. But if there's no design plan and nature's all that exists, then why should things be any different than they are? And is anything actually truly evil? The answer is no. Again, to the extent that it's important for an intrinsic reason to have moral guilt, regret, condemnation, agency, and ability and duty to do otherwise. Bottom line is, there's no evil in a naturalistic universe. And how do we understand all this from a naturalist perspective? You can't. How do we look at things and just simply say, well, I'm just having an emotional reaction to that? It's like, no, I'm not just having an emotional reaction to the Holocaust. I'm not just having an emotional reaction to some things that happened in Asia, the genocides in Asia and Africa. I'm not just having an emotional reaction to slavery. These aren't just emotional reactions. These aren't just conditioned responses. These things are evil, and thus we have a duty to oppose them. And Christianity, I would argue, is the only real answer to evil in our world. We face suffering and death not because suffering and death are good, but because the resurrection of Jesus Christ robs them of their meaning. What is suffering in the face of the resurrection? What is death in the face of the resurrection? Nothing. Momentary blips that you pass through and are done and it's over. What does the naturalist have to offer? Death is eternal. Death never ends. Death is permanent. What about suffering? Suffering may just be your lot in life. And that's it. There's no hope of redemption of a life lost through suffering. Christianity writes this fallen and immoral world. And now I'd like to go ahead and read a quote from the book. Actually, two quotes. And these are some phenomenal quotes from it. Great missionary to India, E. Stanley Jones once gave an address on evil and suffering in which he offered the Christian response to suffering. Quote, that you can take hold of suffering and sorrow and frustration and injustice and not bear it, but use it. Almost everything beautiful in the pages of the New Testament has come out of something ugly. Almost everything glorious has come out of something shameful. Christians don't ask to be exempt. They don't ask to be taken out of suffering. All they ask is inner soundness of spirit so that they can take hold of the raw materials of human life as it comes to them. Justice and injustice, pleasure and pain, compliment and criticism. And they can take it up into the purpose of their lives and transmute it and make it into something else. That is an open possibility of living in spite of. In the same address, Jones tells us of the conversion of the 20th century political and military leader General Chiang Kai-shek. His wife attributes his embrace of Christianity to the witness of the Christian medical worker whose lived out response to evil testified to the gospel's truth. Quote, when Chiang Kai-shek's army swept across that country in the early days, and they looted a hospital belonging to a missionary, his life went to pieces. But he followed after the army and tended to their sick and their wounded. When Chiang Kai-shek heard about it, he said, what makes this man follow after and tend to the sick and wounded to the very people who looted his hospital? What makes him do it? And he said he's a Christian, that's why he does it. And Chiang Kai-shek said, if that's what it means to be a Christian, I'm going to be a Christian. Then in the midst of an anti-Christian movement that was sweeping the country, to the astonishment of everybody, Chiang Kai-shek announced that he was a Christian. The doctor had calamity come upon him, but through that calamity, he showed his spirit. And through the revelation of that spirit, he won one of the greatest men of this age. And through him, it may win a great nation. You see, he took hold of injustice and turned it into something else. He mastered a way to live, and it may be that through your suffering and frustration and defeat, you can show a spirit, and that spirit will do far more work than all of your years of work. They'll look through that little revelation, and they'll see something eternal abiding in that moment. That's the Christian answer. The Christian answer is to take hold of everything and make it into something else. That is victory. And so, again, you see this issue of evil, and we look at these great evils, and yet there are people who in Christ, in God, stood in the face of it, suffered along with others, or just in themselves, and God produced a testimony through that, and the gospel went forth. Now, I'd also like to mention a little bit about moral knowledge, and then finally moral faith, before we close. So when we talked about moral knowledge, we talked about a certainty with which we can understand what's right or wrong. And I think those who attribute, or those who hold to a form of relative morality have not truly thought, and I say that carefully. I'm not saying that they haven't thought at all, that they haven't thought deeply, but they haven't truly thought about the existential crisis that should be occurring when one detaches themselves from an absolute concept of right and wrong. And I say that because it is actually quite dangerous. It's dangerous because most people who hold to a relative morality still actually hold to a roughly Judeo-Christian morality. They typically reject the following things. They reject the abortion issue, they reject the euthanasia issue, and they reject the sexuality laws. But in terms of stealing, in terms of murder, in terms of things of that nature, they still hold to a relatively Judeo-Christian worldview, at least on that. But if you truly become an absolute or a relativist in morality, you have to let those go. You have to say everything's up for grabs. And that should not just cause one pause, that should, because this is the thing, sometimes people say, oh, well, yeah, that was a scary moment when I had to really contemplate this. And I'm like, let's think about this. It's scary to contemplate that morality might not be absolute. Why? Because if it isn't absolute, our entire civilization, and I do mean the entire world civilization, collapses. So if you have no true morality and everybody truly went relativistic and everybody went and did whatever they wanted to do, the Bible actually tells us what would happen. People were killing each other left, right, and center. Civilization was collapsing. So God stepped in and instituted governments and other types of things like that to counteract that. And so it would happen again. You see this whenever anarchy reigns. Its civilization begins to crumble. And that should give us pause. And that should also indicate that maybe we're on the wrong track. That maybe this whole relative moral thing was actually not a good idea. That this actually has led to a lot of evil and a lot of suffering. Now, people say, oh, well, Christianity will deal in suffering. No. What happens with Christianity is this. With Christianity and the rise of the empires, the Christian empires, if you will, you had political people who are not operating according to Christian principles in any way, shape, or form begin to commit atrocities. Also, Christians have done horrible things to each other. I won't disagree with that. But when you actually look at the greatest atrocities in history, most of them occurred in the 19th century, and most of them were conducted under atheistic governments, or governments that totally rejected religion and God of any kind. And you have the major genocides of the modern era. So that's not the case. Christian governments never led to mass genocide of hundreds of millions of people. Okay, there may have been Christian groups that killed off or tried to kill off other Christian groups. I won't deny that that's a possibility. We know that there's a lot of infighting and a lot of heresy and condemning people and killing people. But if you're talking about 100 million people killed, yeah, none of them are going to even reach anywhere near that. So we've got those types of issues that come out with moral knowledge. And the reality that if you lose moral knowledge, I don't even know how you know how to act, how to behave. Well, society will tell me, yeah, but you can kind of be thrown adrift by society. But again, then you're just sort of fitting in to fit in, and you change with the tides. And again, your life lacks stability, it lacks focus, and it lacks meaning. By having moral knowledge, we can understand how we're supposed to relate to each other, how we're supposed to interact with each other, what is good, when have I done good to someone, when have I not done good to someone. I mean, arguably the problem with most of our issues in relationships is not lack of warming up to somebody properly, but it's actually inappropriate action toward each other. And what then about moral faith? Well, this is the other piece, and I would argue this might be one of the most important pieces. The only way to get better morally in a naturalistic environment is to change your morals to conform to your current actions, or to try and strive to attain a certain action. But that's very difficult. Most people would argue that you're not going to ever make it. You're not going to ever get there. What does Christianity say? Christianity simply says you're absolutely right. You're never going to get there if you keep trying to do this yourself. You're simply going to have to rely on the fact that God will transform you. And he does that in part initially, when he transforms us through being born again. And he gives us a heart that longs for and loves God. And he has to give that to you. To the non-Christian who might be listening to this, God has to give that to you. He has to give you a new heart. The only way that can happen is if you intellectually submit to him and say, I submit to you, please give me the new heart. And the only way to become better morally on this earth is through the process of sanctification, where the Spirit is in a mysterious way, through learning of Scripture, through a renewing of our mind, he is bringing us into conformity with Jesus Christ. And the only way to become morally perfect is to be rid of this body and receive a resurrection body in the future. To die, be released from this world of sin and evil, brought into heaven, sanctified completely, and then given a resurrection body, that's the end. And then we live with each other in the new heavens and new earth for all eternity, free of evil. Free of evil, and literally living out the moral argument. And so that's kind of where I wanted to end tonight. I wanted to end simply with a bit of a reflection here on the moral argument, a bit of a reflection on the different tenets of it, some of the implications. And I hope you guys have enjoyed the series. It's been fun for me to do. It's a little bit different. I know I'm kind of pontificating a little bit more throughout the talk as opposed to having it all prepped. It's something I don't know how much more I'll do that in the future, but I wanted to at least try it out. It's a different method of doing this, but it's been a lot of fun. As well, I'll also tell you this, for our next series, we're having one more talk on Hanukkah next week. And then after that, we're starting 2 new series. We're going to be actually starting a defense of Calvinism, 5-point Calvinism. And we're also going to be starting the covering biblical manhood and womanhood lessons. And I'm very excited about both of those. They're going to be a lot of fun. So I hope you join us soon. Thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church, and I hope you have a wonderful night.